Hello, my friends. This is Nefer Kefri, the Positive Vibes Artist. I'm here today to take you through a very simple practice on getting to know your brush and your watercolors. Now, this is a set of Art Whale watercolors. I will link to them below. Very economical set. And this is a page of scrap paper I tore out of a journal. I'm going to be swatching some colors on that paper to show you how to handle a brush. This is known as a round brush. This is a number 8. And you can see the tip of the brush, the bristles are a bit round. They come to a little bit of a point so that when the brush is wet, you can actually paint a fine line with that round brush. But you can also paint very thick lines when you vary the pressure you place on the brush. And here I am adding some water to a couple of the colors here. It's always good when using watercolors, you choose your colors and you add 2 to 3 drops of water to the half pan and let it sit for a minute or two. That will activate the pigments in that watercolor. And here I am putting a couple of drops into my empty ceramic palette here. So I'm going to put a bit of the color in with that water in the palette. And that way I'm not dipping my brush directly into the paint pan every time I get some color. Because when you do that, when you dip your brush directly into the paint pan, you're getting what's called a full load of color. You're getting the absolute most intense version of that watercolor. So here I am putting it into the palette. Now, like I said, I already put a couple of drops of water in there just to dilute the pigment slightly. Personally, I like working with heavier watercolor. I don't tend to use a lot of water in my watercolor paintings. Some do to give a really nice translucent effect. I like bright colors. I like intense colors. It's a personal choice, personal preference. Now, if you'll notice, I'm going very lightly with the brush. And then I press down harder and I get a much thicker line. So I'm going to press harder here. And you see how a lot more paint gets distributed onto the paper. So with a round brush, when you apply the lightest of pressure, you can get a really fine line. And these kind of give you like leaf shapes. And this is actually the way to make a very simple leaf. Now here I am going with a darker color. I believe this is a blue-green. And I'm just going to do the same thing. Very light pressure. Then just push down hard and lift up slowly. And this is just showing you what your brush can do. Just one of the many things it can do. And it's good to fill up a whole page with this practice. Or do it for a few pages, especially if you've never held a paintbrush before. Because it gets some getting used to, and your hand will develop the muscle memory required so that if you haven't been painting for a long time, you can pick up a brush and automatically you're going to know how to hold it. And there's no trick to holding a brush. You just hold it for what's most comfortable to you. I basically use the same grip on the brush that I do on a pencil, just to give you an idea. Now here I am choosing a reddish color. And again, I'm just going to, I have a couple of drops of water in the palette there. I'm adding the pigment to dilute the pigment just a little bit. And I'm going to go ahead and do the same exercise, varying the pressure I place on the brush. So very light for the line, and then pressing down to get the thicker leafy shape. Again, very light, push it down, and then lift up. Do the same thing again, push it down, slowly lift up, And there you go. You get a very nice variation in your lines here. And this again is just simply teaching you to use the brush. And now here what I'm doing is I'm getting a darker color still. I think this is going to be a purple. I'm not sure. I had these watercolors swatched on another piece of paper, and then I lost that paper. So I don't remember the order in which the colors are here in my set. But I think this is going to be either a very dark blue or a purple. So there's just a little bit on the brush. You can't really see it because it's a dark color like the bristles. But again, I'm going to use very light pressure just to get a line to show up on the paper. And then I'm going to push down to get that thicker, leafy looking shape. See, you push it down and slowly drag your brush across the paper and slowly lift back up so that gives you a thin line going into the leafy shape and a thin line coming out of it. And then you just repeat the process. And watch what happens when you dip your brush directly into the paint pan. I don't have it on my palette here. Some of the color didn't transfer. That's because I don't have enough water on my brush. You can just go back and fill it in. Or I could have gone to my water and added like half a drop of water to it, and then the paint would have run into the rest of that shape. Now this is a really good practice to do, and I really recommend you fill up several sheets of watercolor paper just doing this. Because again, you're learning how to hold your brush if you've never held one before, and you're also learning what happens when you vary the pressure that you use with your watercolor brush. They are very versatile, the round watercolor brushes, because they do come to that point. So they do allow you to make that fine line on the paper if you need to. And there I am just adding a bit of water. And again, I'm using that same purpley dark blue color, this time with water on my palette. So I'll have enough water on my brush to where I'll get a really good amount of color onto the paper. And again, we're just doing the same thing. Very light pressure to get that fine line, and then we push down to get the thicker leaf shape, lightly let up on the pressure, and then we'll start to get that thin line at the bottom, continue it, then push down again, and we get a second leafy shape. And this is also a very relaxing meditative exercise that you can do. Like let's say you're in an artistic slump, you really don't know what to do. This can help to get you going. It's also a really good method to use to swatch your watercolors to see what the colors look like in your set. And then you can keep that swatch in with your paints. And if the paints have names on the half pan, or if you're using tubes, of course the tubes will have names on them. You can write the names in between the lines of shapes. Now here I am, just dragging the brush along its side and lifting up. And you get this kind of like a triangular shape. And then I'm going back to fill it in just so you can see the shape better on the screen. So you can do all sorts of things with a watercolor brush. Again, I'm just laying it on its side, and I'm slowly dragging it down the paper and lifting up gradually. This is just a nice little practice exercise. And you can see how colorful my palette's gotten. And I'm getting some red here on the brush. And I'm going to make some dots. Now you hold your brush straight up and down and lightly tap the tip on the paper. And you can test yourself. See how small of a dot you can make with the tip of your watercolor brush. You'll be surprised. I mean, the dots are so small here, you can barely see them on the screen, but they're there, and they're made with the very tip of the brush. Now I'm taking a much larger brush. This is a size 10, and I'm wetting the paper first. This is called a clean wash. We're adding a clean wash of color, which isn't exactly clean because my water's a bit dirty now, but you get the idea. That should be clean water. And I'm just going to put some paint in it to watch and see what the paint does with the water. And you'll see if you add your water first to the paper and then add your pigment, the pigment will only flow where water is present. It will not extend beyond the shape of the water that you placed on the paper. I placed an oval on here. That pigment is going to stay exactly within that oval. It's not going to leak out of there and run across the page. Now it will if you turn the page completely on its end and, bang it on the table a few times. You can get the paint to drip past where you've laid your water. But you're only going to be doing that if you want certain effects, like maybe for an abstract painting. Here, we're just seeing what the paint does when we add it to a pool of water that's already on the paper. Now here I am adding a bit more water, and I'm making sure it touched that oval that's already on the paper just for a bit of spread to see if the colors are going to run together. But here's the pigment. The paint is staying directly within that oval shape pool of water on the paper. And then you can turn it and watch the paint kind of, go with the flow. And that's what a lot of what we're going to be doing is going to be about, going with the flow. With watercolor, you can't really force the issue. That's the thing with watercolor. It's going to go where the water flows. And sometimes, well, not sometimes, oftentimes, the water will not flow exactly where you want it to go. But you have to develop that attitude of going with the flow, taking things as they come, and being happy with the result. Because the thing is, it's not really the end result that's important here. It's the process. And the process, it makes you feel a certain way. And end result, if it turns out looking great, that's awesome. Bonus. But the thing we are most interested in is the process. And especially when it comes to journaling and writing down your thoughts. It's not what the page ends up looking like, or you coming to some great epiphany on this journal page. It is just the process of getting your thoughts on paper. Just like watercolor, it's the process of getting the pigment on the paper. So if you notice here, I now have 4 oval shapes coming out from a center spot. And basically what that is, it's a whimsical flower. You can, make whimsical flowers. You use 4 or 5 petals. That's the definition of a whimsical flower. It's not a flower direct from nature. It comes from your imagination. So this is what I've done here. And I'm adding just a bit more pigment in there because that last oval is not as red as I wanted it to be. And then you let the water and the pigment play a little bit together. And you turn your paper and you tilt it various ways and you get that pigment to move. And as it begins to dry, it'll start to move a little less. And now we look back at our first oval there in the upper left-hand corner. It is pretty much half dry now. And what you can do at this point, you can go back in with more red if you want to darken that petal. Now see how it's not really running down the page? That's because, again, that oval is drying off. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to add some water and kind of push the paint a little bit. And that will distribute the watercolor across that entire petal and give me a darker shade of red than what I started with. Because that's the thing about watercolors. They look really, really dark as they first go on, but as they dry, they're going to lighten considerably. And then you can just go in as they dry and add more pigment, which is what I'm doing here. And you can add a little bit more water also. And that's why it's important to use watercolor paper minimum 140 pounds or 300 GSM. It'll say right on the package. And if you get higher than 140 pounds, higher than 300 GSM, that's great. The higher the numbers, the more water that paper will be able to accept without totally buckling up on you and making a mess. So you definitely want to be doing this on anything defined as watercolor paper. And there are also there's different grades. You can look at 140-pound watercolor paper and see there's a number of different brands who make it. And some will be much better than others. And I've got another video where I'm going to be discussing the different brands of paper and what I consider to be the best papers. For right now, you just need a good quality student grade paper. The brand Canson makes a paper that is excellent for practice. I mean, I would never create a final piece for sale on Canson paper, though, not ever, ever. But for practice and for journaling, adding pages to an art journal, or even buying a spiral-bound watercolor art journal from Canson is a great way to start. And that's how I started. Now here I am. I turned that into a flower by putting some yellow in the center, and I started at the bottom with heavy pressure and lightened it up as I moved the stem up to the flower, because we know stems are thicker at the bottom, much thinner at the top. And now I'm just going to make some long wispy shapes here to mimic leaves, because this is not a real flower. It's a flower from my imagination, so it doesn't have to be true to life. And again, it's just a little exercise. And here I am going light on the pressure. You can't really see because my hand's in the way. I apologize for that. But there's the little stem I made. And then I'm going to go heavy on the pressure to get the leaf shape. And then I'm going to lighten up to get it to come to a point. It's the same thing I did on the right-hand side. Same exercise. It's just that now that exercise has been given form. The form of leaves on a flower. So, and it's really simple. Once you practice this brush movement, you'll be able to make leaves, until you've got them coming out of your ears if you want. But I know it looks like, oh, I don't know if I can do that. You can do it. If you can vary pressure with your hand, you can do this. It's very simple. And just, just practice. Practice until it becomes, familiar to you, and until you realize, hey, look, every time I pick up the brush, I'm holding it like this. Because you're going to have a natural way that you hold the brush. Everybody does. And a lot of people will say, oh, you need to hold your brush at a 45-degree angle and blah, 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 blah. I don't believe any of that. I learned on my own, and I just held the brush the way I wanted. Now here I'm just showing you the other side of this watercolor paper. Sometimes if the watercolor paper has a very high cotton content to it, it will go to the other side. And sometimes it doesn't. Thank you for watching. Have a wonderful day ahead.